I can do it.
Stop. Okay.
There never seems to be a problem when developers want to build more houses and condos. Are we short on water or are we not? Cover it live. Sherry wants to know. Is there anything that stops, why aren't developers stopped for lack of water? Don't we ever say anything to them?
If there are areas where we feel that the resources are at risk or we don't have enough capacity, then we'll stop those developments or we'll restrict those developments. For Oahu's case, what's actually happened, total water use for Oahu from the Board of Water Supply, rather than continue to climb and increase over time, has actually gone down. From 1990 to the present, it dropped about 9% island-wide. And we attribute that to water conservation, water efficiency in the building codes, recycled water, people becoming more aware, and also the cost of water and sewer services is creating more incentive for people to conserve.
Lori on Kauai wants to know, is there long-term use of agricultural chemicals ruining our water? They're interested in this problem over on Kauai.
First of all, it's principally an issue that the Department of Ag or the Department of Health manages. We don't deal with pesticides per se. That's an Ag or Health Department issue. We do require the water quality plan so that aspect has to be brought into the planning. And by the way, Gary Gill will be at our October meeting to talk about this in mid-October. So that's a live subject right now. But the principal regulation comes through federal law and also the Department of Ag. So I think you need to address that to those folks.
Is part of the permitting for a development that they have to check with you guys?
Yes. They have to consult with us. They usually start off with an inquiry about water availability. What we do is we hold off a water commitment to the developer to the very last moment. So if things change or conditions change, we can then restrict or change our conditions on the development. At the time of building permit or submission of construction plans for improvements to the infrastructure, that's when we'll make a commitment to the developers.
In terms of a permit, literally a permit.
A water use allocation from our system capacity. Or they may have to develop their own sources, store reservoirs, or pipelines.
Well, I agree with Ernie, but there's one thing that tends to happen in the planning commissions, the land use commission, Board of Land and Natural Resources. People come in one by one for these permits, and if you ask, is there water now? The answer is yes. The problem is not literally in the next couple of years. The problem is as you start to approach the limits of the supply, if you haven't planned and sort of kapu'd water for future generations, for future ag needs, or as we're facing now, the decline in overall rainfall, then what you do is you get to a situation where, for example, you want to build a school someplace and people have already used up the close water that's easy to get. Like Hawaiian Homes, for example, is faced with the problem that they know what their water needs may be, but they don't have the money to build the infrastructure. So when it comes time to do it, 10 years from now, they can't drill there. They're going to have to drill 5 miles away, which means you got to build the infrastructure and go further and deeper. So the delay in the public sector of getting their projects online is going to result in more expense to the taxpayer for those projects unless we start putting together what the public needs are early enough to say this area is going to be kapu'd for future public needs.
And if I could say, the approach for the county water use and development plans, which is part of the Hawaii plan under the code, for Oahu, our objectives are to promote sustainable watersheds, protect and enhance water quality and quantity, protect Native Hawaiian rights and traditional cultural practices, facilitate public participation, education, and implementation of projects, and meet future demands at reasonable costs. So we try to factor those things, at least on Oahu, area by area with those communities. It is a slower process. It requires a lot of dialogue and discussion. And we work closely with our Department of Planning and Permitting to do this.
The real question is, the hard choices haven't been made. 30 years ago, John Mink, a hydrologist and the husband of Patty Mink, said, you can put 2 million people on this island with the water that we have without being paving over everything. And the question is, do we have enough water for agriculture, for stream life? And he's listing basically, I hate to put it this way, a motherhood and apple pie kind of list where all of these are desirables, but what's the priority? What's the hard choice? If you have to make a choice between development and taro, what are you going to choose?
Don't they all, Ed, my guess is you would think they always come down on the side of development.
Yes, sir. Development will be the first priority over taro, and it clearly identifies that as sugar when they did all the diversions throughout the years, through all the islands. They took away the resources from these taro fields. Now those taro fields cannot be activated again because that resources was taken away and allocated for residential or commercial properties. Once you allocate that river, it's very hard to get it back.
Now, you've been attacked for motherhood and apple pie objectives, I believe, by Williamson. Are you going to take that, Ernie?
You know, I'm a kind of a simple person and a little corny at times, so I really believe in some of these things. And, you know, I think it's the issue of people working together. We'd like to project out what the ultimate development will be in areas, but we really don't know what the magic ball will say, what development and market forces will dictate growth. But I think it's important that we keep in mind, keeping a close eye on the resources, and when we get even close, and Bill, I think you've come up with a precautionary principle that in lack of science, you know, we're going to err on the side of being conservative and protect the resources. So as we do this long-term planning, we need to look forward as long as we can look forward. And if we anticipate growth in different areas, then we need to evaluate its impact on the resources. And if we feel it's at risk, then we'll have to step in to do that. You know, I on Kauai, I was a water manager on Kauai Department of Water for a while. And they accused me of being the second water department there, second planning department, because I refused so many permits. Because I didn't have an adequate infrastructure. I think the question is going to be, and it's an age-old question, does water decide how we grow, or does other quality of life issues decide how we grow? And then are the resources adequate or not? And if they're not, then we have to change our approach.
I suggest a rule of thumb that I find really useful is to think like a grandparent, not like a parent, but like a grandparent, because you have to anticipate another generation beyond you. And when you do that, you change your time frame. And with water, it's very difficult because you're making investments that are going to last 40 or 50 years. And so we've got to change from just a cost expense kind of thinking from year to year to what we're going to do for our grandchildren.
But the next question, Bill, is that you teach at the William S. Richardson School of Law. Nobody ever wrote better law, at least in regard to access to the ocean, for example, and Hawaiian rights, than Bill Richardson did, right?
Right.
And yet Bill's been gone a while, and he hadn't been on a court in a long, long time, and yet you're saying that we're 25 years behind in trying to protect water. Why haven't we gotten way beyond this and not have any diversion at all, and water rights be changed entirely? Why hasn't that happened?
Because we haven't made the hard decisions. We were supposed to, when we developed the water code, it was time for planning ahead, like he said, as if you're a grandparent, thinking ahead 40, 50, 100 years. What is Hawaii going to look like? Is it going to have any taro? Is it going to have more development? We're just, as Bill has pointed out, taking developers one by one and allocating water to them without thinking of the big picture, what it's going to look like 50, 60, 100 years from now.
You were going to say something.
There is a great tendency, no offense to engineers, but if most people, if they're told...
I'm an engineer.
That means you're about to get it. When a guy says something like that, you're about to get it, Ernie.
Like the military to some extent, if you're asked to do something, you're trained to say, yes, I can do it. And so an engineer or the board of water supply or somebody says, can you find water? And the answer usually is yes. Very seldom do people say no. So the sea anchor question that Bill Chang points out is, where's the forcing mechanism to actually require us to think in a very specific way in a specific place about what this is going to look like. And the forcing mechanism has not been there for a long time. It's coming.
Tell me about this water commission. What's the water commission?
The Water Commission has built
The Hawaii Water Commission.
Correct. It was in 1978. The Constitution was amended to say the state must protect the water resources, and the legislature to pass a water code. It took us 9 years. In 1987, it was passed, and there are 7 members: the chairman of the Board of Land and Natural Resources by virtue of his office, the chairwoman of the Department of Health, Loretta Fuddy, by virtue of her office, an individual who has an expertise in Native Hawaiian rights, and then 4 other individuals, not by county. And there's a reason for that. And the reason is the danger of having someone from that county become sort of the konehiki and everybody defers to them. So the notion is all 7 are expert in water. They're appointed by the governor from a nominating committee's selection of at least three individuals. Then they're confirmed by the Senate. So they serve 4 years, and they can serve up to 2 terms.
Who does the nominating?
There's a nominating committee that's 4 individuals. President of the Senate, Speaker of the House choose 1 person each. The governor chooses 2. That group vets all the applicants, sends to the governor at least 3 individuals for each open position, and it's a rotating board. So about every year or 2, there's 1 or 2 people coming on and coming off.
How many taro farmers make it onto this commission? Is there an Ed Witt on this commission? Are there people like that, or are they people who, might be more in the power circle? And
I don't know of any taro farmers to date. I can't think of any.
Yeah, I know that's a good question, because I've been asked that many times about having someone with, even myself, to sit on this, and it never did happen. And I'm not sure if they got anyone now.
Kamana Beamer, who's the Beamer family, was recently selected. He is a new member of the commission. And he brings an enormous knowledge of the Mahale and that period, because he's a scholar of that era. In fact, his book is about to come out this October, I believe. And he's a very thoughtful person. So I think he will bring an enormous knowledge of Hawaiian history to the commission.
I heard about this. I think he's coming on. I think in our situation is, like earning native rights. And we're native rights in the public trust. We know we have constitutional rights. It's enforcing the laws. It's one thing. How do you have the officials enforce the law?
have you ever had to go before the Water Commission to ask for something or testify?
We've gone through all of this together, and also with the DLNR and BLNR and the Water Commission. I mean, what we have experienced is enforcement. Why did, after we come out of court, judge say 180 days to release the water? Took 7 years.
That's a long time. If we miscalculate on all of this and we run out of water, you engineers have not calculated correctly, Ernie, who will be responsible? What entity is in charge of making sure we don't run out?
State Water Commission. That's their constitutional and statutory charge, is to be sure to conserve water for the future. But as I said before, we don't have the plan. We haven't made the hard choices.
Go ahead.
If I could add to that, State Water Commission regulators, I represent a utility that provides water to our community, and water is important for life. A little corny though. Yeah. As a utility though, I have a trust responsibility to make sure that there are water for people on at least on Oahu, adequate water supply today and into the future. So we will be watching that, and we have initiated long-term planning and actually looking at up to 2060 in terms of impacts on rainfall, working with the University of Hawaii. So we are committed to the long-term planning and to support and ensure that the resources are preserved, protected, and there for the community.
One additional thing I think we haven't touched on is stream flows. And one of the obligations the commission has is to protect the in-stream flows. There was an old notion that if water was left in the stream, it was wasted. Well, that notion is pretty antiquated now, because if you talk to fishermen, that water is essential for the estuaries and the coral. That's essential to have a healthy fisheries. One of the problems we're having with surface water runoff that takes topsoil and pollutions into the ocean is killing reefs. So one of the things we're really focused on is part of the way we protect our coral reefs and our fisheries is what we do on the land side. And that is affected a lot by water. For example, when you have a very large rain event, and that water runs off quickly.
You see it, yeah.
Right. There's a couple of problems with that. One is it doesn't recharge the groundwater. So like the dams and reservoirs that have been built over the last 100 years are actually really important to capture that pulse of stormwater so it can stay there, recharge the groundwater. Many of those dams and reservoirs aren't being maintained or used anymore. If that runs off, it also takes a lot of dirt with it. There's a study on the East Shore of Molokai that says that about 50% of the soil that gets into the coral comes from about only 3% of the land, usually the steep unvegetated portions. We need to start going back and looking at especially in the leeward sides, how do we manage our lands? Because that's going to be critical in this.
Yeah, it seems to me there's just an awful lot of interrelated stuff here. I mean, stream flow, maintenance of watersheds, even feral animals that can destroy watersheds, right? Or destroy them.
That's actually part of the state's, the DLNR's Rainfall Follows the Forest initiative, which was Arian and Bill talked about briefly. If we don't protect that upper area where the native plants are, and frankly, we're going to have to fence some of the goats and the pigs and the deer out, then we're going to have invasives move up, native plants which capture the water are going to be eliminated, and we're going to lose even more rain. If you talk to Sumner Erdman at Ulapalakua Ranch, in his lifetime, he's talked about invasives going from 800 feet elevation to 1,300 feet elevation, and he's a cattleman, and he's got a drought on his hands just because of that problem that's occurred in his own lifetime. So we're going to have to do something about that. I will also encourage people to look on the web at a place called Wahi, which is part of his ranch, and there's been enormous effort at restoring dryland forest there, essentially by fencing and taking out the invasives. And you can actually see it from the Google Earth.
And it occurs to me that some of the same people who live in your part of the island might very well be hunters and if you said to them, we got to worry about feral animals, we don't want those, we don't want, they'd give you trouble.
Yes, but what we're finding out with the feral pigs on our side, the state had put high elevation fence lines, and then the hunters come from the bottom up. Evidently it's working because they've done this for a while. You don't hear real much hunters catching wild boar. But the invasive species, it is terrible. It is literally taking over the whole rainforest. And it is going up to the higher elevation. And all the diversions that is on the streams and rivers, the water does not reach the ocean. It has killed the life, the cycle of the Oopu, Opai, Hi'iwai. Nothing below. You must hike for miles to go to their ditches and be able to gather and harvest. I listen to you and you have a great mana'o for Oahu. Sound like Oahu is the invasive species. It, yes, but what we're finding out with the feral pigs on our side, the state had put high elevation fence lines, and then the hunters come from the bottom up. Evidently it's working because they've done this for a while. You don't hear real much hunters catching wild boar. But the invasive species, it is terrible. It is literally taking over the whole rainforest. And it is going up to the higher elevation. And all the diversions that is on the streams and rivers, the water does not reach the ocean. It has killed the life, the cycle of the Oopu, Opai, Hi'iwai. Nothing below. You must hike for miles to go to their, for a while. You don't hear real much hunters catching wild boar. But the invasive species, it is terrible. It is literally taking over the whole rainforest. And it is going up to the higher elevation. And all the diversions that is on the streams and rivers. The water does not reach the ocean. It has killed the life, the cycle of the Oopu, Opai, Hi'iwai. Nothing below. You must hike for miles in rivers. The water does not reach the ocean. It has killed the life, the cycle of the Oopu, Opai, Hi'iwai. Nothing below. You must hike for miles to go to their ditches and be able to gather and harvest. I listen to you, and you have a great malaho for Oahu. Sound like Oahu is doing fine on water. And I know Bill for many years, and this gentleman here who speaks on native rights. But we see on Maui, Maui is hurting. Maui needs water for development, to grow. The sugar company takes over 60 billion gallons of water. I do not know the county of Maui how much water they do take. But from what I realize and heard and know, people of country cannot even have a permit to build a home because there's no water. So for our island, water is very precious, and it's getting more scarce.
Is the situation as complex as the one that Ed described? Is it as complex on the Big Island as on
In Kona, not on the windward side of the Big Island. On the dry side in Kona, Kauai South is an area that's going to get increased attention. In fact, last month, the National Park Service filed a petition with the Water Commission to designate Keauhou area right from the airport toward Honokahau. That area, if you look at the development plans in that area, there's an enormous amount of proposed development. The water table there is very thin. There is not much groundwater. There is some mauka water in perched areas, but that's an area we're going to have to take a look at. And so that's probably the next Maui.
Some of the outer islands don't have a quantity problem. They have a problem of getting water from where it's wet to where it's dry. But I wanted to go back to an earlier point, which was he said basically the streams are running dry. The water code has a mechanism, and it was to be enforced, which was interim stream flows or in-stream flow standards. And we've just around now gotten around to setting those. And for years, they just said whatever is in the stream is the standard. It's another problem of enforcement. We have some of these things on the books that can remedy the situation. And it's been, 20, 30 years since the water code, and we haven't been able to enforce or put into effect standards which streams should have to flow through the ocean.
Several people have asked this. This is Charles on Lahaina. What are we doing about desalination plants? Why don't we have many of these? Are we doing anything about desalination?
It is something that we're looking at. However, desalination is actually very expensive. So its use is going to have to come at a time where it makes economical sense to go to desalination. For Oahu, we still have a pretty abundant supply of groundwater. It's going to get more expensive. That doesn't mean that all 400 million gallons is developable at a very affordable rate. So at some point we may cross over to desalination. Other areas that are water short, it is still an expensive option.
It would be too expensive to do something like that for, say, the Leeward area of the Big Island or for parts of Maui.
It would depend on if the community or the residents that are going to use that water can afford to pay for that.
It's very electric intensive. That requires a lot of electricity. You have brine you have to dispose of. It can be used in small isolated places that have no other choices. But I'm very skeptical of using a lot of desalt as an answer to large-scale
I think
reuse.
One thing that kind of we're forgetting is actually, I think what the Native Hawaiians knew, that you don't want to waste water. You want to use water very efficiently for what you need. Take only what you need. I think the idea of conservation, extending the resource, preserving the resource, protecting it is very important. And it's actually probably a more cost-effective way to extend our water supplies to deal with climate change in the future.
That's actually a really important point. If you were to spend $1 million on new source development or use it in the forest, if you restore the forest, you'll collect more water than you would have for the 1,000,000 gallons you've tried to pull out. So protecting the forest is the best long-term thing we can do.
Yeah, when you think about what Ed is saying, before Cook came, there were 800,000 Hawaiians living here who lived off the surface water and grew taro, not touching the groundwater. And you had a population of 800,000. It was comfortable. And they fed each other, they clothed each other, and basically they supported that kind of a population. What's gone wrong? That's the question.
Perhaps we're not as easily self-sufficient now as we were in 1773, or
No, we're not also good conservators of water.
Williamson, somebody wants to know, do you think we need to truly cancel all existing water rights to ensure there's enough water for today's farms?
Cancel water rights?
Yeah.
No, that would be canceling Ed's water rights. Ed has the highest water rights, the pertinent water right. And, you know, in 1973, we had the McBride decision, which basically transformed private ownership of water to a public trust. So we've done a lot of canceling, and that's very controversial, going back to 1973.
James, a water konohiki from Hana, Maui, I think you know James. Panel is wrong. There's still Hawaiian ahupuahas that are still intact. We own the water, period. Culturally, we have the right to clean the rivers and be sure the water runs down. I've told Mr. Went that for years. You have the right to stop the diversions. These leases died in 1929. Bill, you're giving me a funny look. What's that look?
Well, I've heard about it. You know, I believe that we do own the water, because the water in our area, because what has happened, the diverter has just come and just take our water, but I'm not the law. So you have to answer that.
Well, you're the law. You're the law.
The concept which the Supreme Court has articulated in the Waiholia case is that of a public trust doctrine. And that notion of being a steward, the sovereign as the steward, is very much what actually was occurring during the pre-contact period. There were shared arrangements. There was reciprocity between the king and the people. Both had obligations. Both had benefits. And in some ways, what the secular law is today is very similar in its structure to what was before. Hawaii is not like the Western United States. It is not a prior appropriation model, which is like last in, first out. That's the way they do it in California. It's not the way they do it in Hawaii. Everyone has a shared use here. It's a question of how do you work out that sharing.
Mike in East Maui says, for many years, the East Maui Irrigation Company has been diverting water. Their system is deteriorating and leaking lots of water. Is any agency seeing that they are operating efficiently? Are there agencies who look at deteriorating systems? Is that done by city, by county, or state, or?
Right now, East Maui Irrigation is the sole